Hello, everybody. I'm Harvey Mansfield. This is the program on constitutional government at Harvard. And our speaker today is Michael Auslin. Michael Auslin is a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He's an historian by trade. He's got a BA at Georgetown, PhD at University of Illinois. And he taught in the history department at Yale from 2000 to 2007. And he's a specialist in Japan, where he has also lived and taught. You can see him on TV, and he's a writer for Wall Street Journal, Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, and has an article in the current issue of Foreign Policy. His books are Asia's New Geopolitics, so 2020, and 2017, The End of the Asian Century, War, Stagnation, and the Risks in the world's most dynamic region. Before that, 2011, Pacific Cosmopolitans and Cultural History of U.S.-Japan Relations, and Negotiating with Imperialism. That was still earlier. He's going to talk today on Taiwan, and the title is How to Lose Cold War II, Taiwan, then the balance of powers and political equilibrium. So Michael Auslin.
Thank you. I psyched myself up to stand, so I think I'll just stand, even though we're a pretty small group, but I feel ready to stand, so if you guys don't mind. Professor Mansfield, thank you so much, and to the program on constitutional government for having me here. Laura Donaldson, who helped ensure that I actually got here and know where I'm going. It's a pleasure to be back. I thought instead of doing the usual DC thing, which is I'm based down in DC, which would be to regurgitate the headlines as if they were my own insights and then make a few predictions that will not come true and no one will remember. I thought I would do something a little different with respect to the type of work that Professor Mansfield does here, and maybe take a slightly more serious look at how we got to where we are with China, referencing Taiwan and what's happening in Taiwan, but maybe offer a slightly new approach to thinking about the U.S.-China competition. First, I would have to say, though, that Washington, D.C. is a city where people go to sleep at 8:30 in the evening, and so any incoherence on my part or dullness of wit, I will blame on a wonderful yet late evening at Professor Mansfield's last night, just to make that clear. So let's start off with where we are in a U.S. understanding of our relationship and our competition with China. It's inaccurate, though easy to say, that the U.S. does not take the China challenge seriously. We maintain a huge military presence in the Indo-Pacific. We have alliances. We've been deepening those alliances. We engage in robust diplomacy. We have military cooperation, not only with allies, but with different partners throughout the region. We have trade relations, and though we walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we maintain a deep interest in trade and, of course, cultural relations. And yet, we are consumed, if not panicked, about the China challenge, meaning all of this activity that we are doing in the Indo-Pacific, we somehow feel is falling apart, falling short, or not adapted to the challenge that we face today. Some say we're losing ground in the Indo-Pacific. Others say that we are holding the line. We can't even agree on whether the People's Republic of China is a competitor, an adversary, or maybe even an enemy. In other words, and I'm speaking again from the Washington perspective, we have not identified our goal in the Indo-Pacific. We have not articulated a strategy for the Indo-Pacific, despite documents bearing that term. And we are struggling to bring coherence to our policy. What is it that we want to do? So are we beset by strategic confusion or strategic timidity? And I would argue it's a bit of a combination of both. We haven't learned yet how to articulate for ourselves what we're doing vis-a-vis China. Some say, for example, that the Chinese play chess while we play checkers, or the Chinese play Go while we play checkers. I've never really understood what that means. They're neat little analogies, but they don't explain much. So perhaps some clarity and even rigor could be brought to both our thinking and our policy debates by suggesting that we have not recognized that we and the Chinese are playing two different strategies. The Chinese are playing a balance of power strategy, while we are playing a political equilibrium strategy. That's really what I want to talk about today, and I will reference Taiwan. I will talk about Taiwan within that broader framework. But I draw those two distinctions, those two strategies from the work of one of my mentors, the eminent European diplomatic historian Paul Schrader, and particularly his 1991 book, The Transformation of European Politics, 1763 to 1848, though also in other writings. Now, Schrader was describing two international systems, which he defined, working off of Michael Oakeshott, as the understandings, assumptions, rules, norms, procedures, and the like, by which a system operates. Schrader argued that what we normally call balance of power, and we apply to the entire post-Napoleonic period, actually is a misnomer. What he called the balance of power was Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, a period of endemic and continuous warfare, in which, as he wrote, the power that is possessed and exercised by states within the system is checked and balanced by the power of others. And so there had to be at least two actors, the existence of two actors of relatively equal power that engaged in constant warfare to balance the other as well as other enemies and adversaries. So it was a zero-sum system. Some of the features of that system of balance of power, again, in the 17th and 18th centuries included flexible alliances, compensations that would equalize the loss of other states, such as for territory and wealth, indemnities, alliances for accruing power and territory, defense of honor and prestige, and raison d'etat, so advancing the interests of the state. And some of the examples that Professor Schrader gave in his in this explication were the War of Spanish Succession, 1702 to 1714, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1773. That's what he called a balance of power. So what was a political equilibrium? A political equilibrium was what he described, obtained in Europe after the Congress of Vienna in the post-Napoleonic era, 1815 to 1914, although he actually ended it a little bit earlier. I'll talk about that in a second. So what was a political equilibrium? Political equilibrium was a system in which the essential power relations were hegemonic. The core of it was again, I'm using his terms here, or his words, a benign shared hegemony and the mutual recognition of rights underpinned by law. This led to a balance, did use the word balance, but a balance of rights, satisfactions, and responsibilities. So in other words, an equipoise between competing powers, marked by self-restraint, moderation, and prudence. Now, the main players in this scheme, Great Britain and Russia, supported geopolitical stability, but they were also invulnerable, meaning that they could enter and exit international power competition at times and places and means of their own choosing. But they did so very infrequently. In fact, Schrader identifies only twice during the period of over 30 years, from 1815 to 1848. So what marks the period most in Schrader's understanding of a political equilibrium was the restraint that was shown by both Great Britain and Russia, particularly under things like the Greek question, the Russo-Turkish War of the 1820s. But it was a system that was seen as legitimate by all parties. The hegemons, Europe, Great Britain, and Russia, and also the smaller nations, France, Austria, Prussia, and the like. I might add, by the way, just parenthetically, that how Schrader describes a political equilibrium, I think perfectly describes Japan in the 250-year plus period from the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate through the end of that period and the beginning of the Meiji Restoration. So again, a period of equilibrium, of poise, of moderation, of self-restraint, of the ability of hegemons to act in ways and places that they choose, but for the most part that they didn't. So ultimately, Schrader then sees history in a very liberal way as a history of systemic institutional change towards greater complexity, subtlety, and the capacity for order and problem solving, therefore progress. He sees it as a system ultimately becoming one of greater cooperation and less competition. This is for his post-Napoleonic period. Obviously, there are periods of regression punctuated by breakdowns in the equilibrium, most notably the Crimean War, but also the revolutions of 1848. And then the system staggers on until the final cataclysm in 1914. But I think that this concept of political equilibrium fairly sums up the US view of the post-World War II, and particularly the post-Cold War international order. It became, I think, an inherited assumption in American international relations theory and practice. And when I say that, I don't mean academic, I mean the policy-making side of it, so the Washington, D.C. side, not the Cambridge side. And in fact, it at least partially answers why US policymakers were satisfied with the equilibrium that they identified in the post-World War II, but again, particularly the post-Cold War period, and saw it as the best achievable system. So that's the academic part. That's trying to take some ideas from Professor Schrader and see if they are helpful in any way to explaining how we've approached US-China relations. So what I'd like to ask is, can we repurpose Schrader to talk about a balance of power and a political equilibrium, not as systems, not as some sort of immanent or ontological system, but rather as strategies? If so, if I'm able to do that, then we're really talking about a competitive dynamic between a balance of power strategy and a political equilibrium strategy. Now, for the US, in the post-Cold War period, we believed in the triumph of a political equilibrium. It went under various names: the hyperpower moment, the Washington Consensus, the end of history, the liberal capitalist order, the liberal international order, or the rules-based international order, which I like to refer to as the Rubio. It's a little Washington humor, a rules-based international, okay. The apex of that triumph in the post-Cold War period would be the incorporation of China into our political system, our political equilibrium. Again, this was the guiding concept on the part of American policymakers post-1992. Now, we pretended or saw or identified this equilibrium, however, as a unitary equilibrium, more like Rome rather than Great Britain and Russia. It was one hegemon, not two hegemons balanced against each other, as Schrader would have it in the Napoleonic era. So to refer briefly, at least for a moment, to Taiwan, I hope you guys didn't come here like hoping just for a Taiwan talk. If you did, I'll do as much as I can. But to refer briefly to Taiwan, it's no surprise that our Taiwan policy, as an outgrowth of this broader China policy, has been based on the concept of equilibrium. Why are we in a struggle over Taiwan? Why are we talking about war over Taiwan? Because we expressed a policy goal, a desirable policy goal at the end, of no unilateral alteration in the status quo over Taiwan. No use of force to change the status quo. We supported ideas, though different interpretations, of a one China policy. And the one time in recent history that we did intervene to deter China, which was the 1995-1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, we did so specifically, explicitly, to uphold the political equilibrium. Whereas under what we might consider a balance of power system, as Schrader described it, for the 17th and 18th centuries, we would have pushed beyond that to change the balance with China at the time and gain some type of competitive advantage. We didn't do that. We simply sought to uphold the status quo, uphold what we saw as the political equilibrium. Meanwhile, and directly related to that 1995-1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, the CCP, the PLA, has been building up the Chinese military precisely in response to the US intervention in the Taiwan Strait. It was when President Clinton brought 2 US aircraft carriers into the strait to deter China from firing ballistic missiles into the waters near Taiwan to intimidate the Taiwanese during their first presidential election. That's about as capsule a description as you could possibly get of what the crisis was. And since that moment, the Chinese have sought to upend that equilibrium, which allowed the United States to do that. And we have been in a nearly 30-year cycle now of the Chinese attempting to ensure that the US could not do it again, but that the broader balance of power between the two countries shifted in China's favor. So the roots of the Taiwan crisis of today, why as we were talking about last night, people in Taiwan and China and the US were wondering if Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi's plane would be shot down as she approached Taiwan a few months ago, if the Chinese would invade Taiwan because of her visit. The roots of this crisis lay at the heart of US-China policy. As I mentioned, in the post-Cold War period, and particularly as we became acclimatized to thinking of China as a liberalizing power thanks to the reforms of Deng Xiaoping, the US goal, I mentioned, was to bind China to our system. We assumed that China would become the tentpole of the new equilibrium. There was talk even in Washington that the US and China would become the joint arbiters, not only of Asia, but of the globe, of course under US rules. That there would be a G2, a new great power condominium, but again, under the rules that the US had set up in the post-1945 system, that Rubio, that rules-based international order. Some, if they had read Schrader, would have said this is exactly what Schrader described in the post-Napoleonic period. 2 invulnerable hegemons who can enter or leave international competition at times and places of their discretion, but acting to uphold the broader system. So the strategy that we followed was to use procedural and institutional binding and entanglement of China. Bring China into the UN, bring it into the World Trade Organization, set up things like the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, which some called a new G2. Later, we refined, or maybe we were simply more desperate, we refined these approaches, asking the PRC to be, quote, a responsible stakeholder, unquote, as former Deputy Secretary of State Robert Zoellick did back in 2005, I believe it was. Even to this day, we are talking about responsible guardrails between ourselves and China, or the latest formulation is to cooperate where we can, but outcompete where we must. Regardless of the formulation and the articulation, the policy, I think, has remained the same. We have implicitly privileged the idea of equilibrium. We have wanted to maintain equilibrium because we thought that, in general, an equilibrium held, and that Chinese attempts to challenge that equilibrium were misguided, misunderstood on their part. They didn't understand what this equilibrium is. They benefit from it, so they certainly wouldn't want to undermine it. They have a stake, a responsible stake, in upholding the rules of the system. Now, in the face of Chinese adversarial actions in recent years, certainly ones interpreted as such by Washington, the US has been adapting our post-World War II alliance system. We've been deepening it. We've been creating new mechanisms such as the Quad and AUKUS. I'll have a piece out soon in Foreign Affairs arguing for a JAUKUS, so we should bring Japan into AUKUS. But all of that has still been with the ultimate goal of defending what we think is a viable equilibrium. Now, in contrast, I would argue that the PRC has been following a balance of power strategy. Their goal has been to chip away at US dominance and our alliance structure. To interpret it again through the lens of Schrader, Beijing does not see the post-Cold War system, even the post-World War II system, but let me just stick with the Cold War, as legitimate. And that was a key element of the Congress of Vienna system. It was seen as legitimate by all parties. They do not see it as legitimate. Like Russia in the post-Napoleonic era, the PRC doesn't need allies, also like Britain. They have geographic invulnerability. short of nuclear war. Asian countries, however, need allies. They're like the smaller Middle European nations in the post-Napoleonic period. They need allies to survive. Britain and Russia didn't. The US and China actually don't need allies. We really don't need allies to survive in the Indo-Pacific. We do need allies if we want to maintain an engaged forward presence. So China actually has more leeway, more freedom of action than we do in the Indo-Pacific region. So they have been acting against US interests. They have been attempting to reshape the balance as they see it in their favor. Let me remind you of one of the definitions of Schrader for a balance of power: the power possessed and exercised by states within the system is checked and balanced by the powers of others. I think that's others. That's a perfect description of how China has attempted to reduce the US influence in the region, or reduce the freedom of action or our strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific, using influence campaigns, intimidation, censorship, intrusive anti-liberal systems, debt diplomacy, all sorts of different tools of statecraft to make sure that what holds is not an equilibrium in which all states act and are treated equally, but in which China has a preponderant power. To go further with the Schraderian comparison, Chinese hegemony is not benign. That was a core element of the post-Napoleonic system, right? Political equilibrium meant that, but the core of it was that hegemony had to act benignly. It was benign. Chinese hegemony, I would argue, I think, and certainly a feeling shared in Washington today, is not benign. The tactics that I've just mentioned, intimidation, influence, censorship, the intrusiveness, predatory nature of Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, threats against Taiwan, though we talked about last night, it's a very complicated issue. Nonetheless, reneging on international agreements over Hong Kong. The question of Tibet, even more complicated. But all of these undertaken more increasingly and with greater frequency by China in recent years, by Beijing in recent years, runs against both the 1815 and the 1945 systems of state sovereignty, in which, to remind, it was critical that small states accepted great power hegemony in return for an acceptance of their independence and rights by the great powers. That's what made the system work, is that the small states felt that their rights and their interests would be protected. That is certainly not the case in Asia today. The smaller states feel threatened, in some cases directly, in some cases indirectly. They do not feel that their rights and interests are protected by a benign great power hegemony. China's expansionist activities, certainly as we would view it, claiming territory claimed by others, India, South China Sea, East China Sea, and the like. All of this leading to a sense that what we do not have is a stability in great power relations, if you view it from what China's doing, not from what the US has perceived the system to be, but rather it is endemic competition, endemic balancing. And I would say, before moving on to begin wrapping up with the question of can we achieve a political equilibrium, is we have to be honest. I think Washington is in the early stages, I would say maybe the second inning of a reassessment of our policy, by understanding that we have actually abetted Chinese behavior over the past 50 years. We have helped strengthen China. We have opened opportunities for Beijing. We have brought it into the international system, again, because we were playing a political equilibrium strategy, not understanding that by strengthening China, abetting it, bringing it into the system, allowed it more effectively to pursue a balance of power strategy. You can't pursue a balance of power strategy without national strength. The buildup from 1976, after the death of Mao, or 1979 and the Deng reforms, or the 92 reaffirmation of the Deng reforms, all has had the end result of enabling China to pursue a balance of power strategy, not enabling China to take up its responsible stakeholding position as a benign hegemon within a political equilibrium. So we didn't do our due diligence, certainly after Tiananmen Square, also after the WTO. We didn't ask the questions of, are we getting to a China that we want to see at the end of this road? the China that we assume was going to emerge, that presidents of both parties for multiple decades told us would ultimately be not just a more cooperative China, but a more liberal China. It wasn't going to look like Peoria, Illinois. It wasn't going to have politics like in Peoria, but it was certainly not going to be Maoist. It was going to be a convergence. This was the core conceit of the Washington Consensus. So we adopted over time, as we saw things moving away from our preferred policy goal, or our preferred policy end, we adopted a strategy of hope, hoping that Beijing would adopt the consensus, become the responsible stakeholder, understand that the equilibrium was in its best interests. So where are we today, and why is this relevant to Taiwan? Obviously, as I've said, maybe to the point of redundancy, we have achieved no political equilibrium with China. We have created neither an understanding nor a mechanism. It is increasingly difficult for Washington to pretend that its unilateral, its unitary equilibrium is real or that it is viable, but we have not adopted the counter viewpoint, which is to accept that we are in a constant 18th century style balance of power competition. The reality is that, and one again that we didn't accept, didn't understand, is that China had its own security interests and increasingly the ability to shape the environment around it. We had, in short, incompatible security drives, unlike Great Britain and Russia after the Napoleonic Wars, where they had compatible security drives. And more importantly, as Schrader points out, London and Moscow's main world interests hardly overlapped. They hardly touched. Russia in the stands, Russia in areas of Eastern Europe, Great Britain in a maritime region, and India and different areas. Ultimately, they did overlap, and that's when the system began to break down. But for a period of well over 30 years, their security interests and world interests did not overlap. Ours overlapped with China from the very beginning. The vacuum in post-1945 Asian politics and great power relations was filled almost by accident by the United States. Our main concern was Europe. Our secondary concern was Asia, but because there was no great power competitor in Asia after 1945, we had a cost-free policy. We didn't have to pay much to be the hegemon in Asia for a period of over 50 years until China could now begin acting in and for its own security interests in a way that were counter to those that we assumed it shared with us. So in short, you cannot have equilibrium if you have two great powers with incompatible security interests. And I would argue also if one of those is an increasingly predatory hegemon. If one party has, let's say, predatory hegemonic designs against Taiwan, you cannot pretend that an equilibrium exists. At the same time, and I think to be fair, we must accept that Beijing does not see the US as being interested in a Schraderian political equilibrium of benign hegemony. They do not see our hegemony as benign. We have to accept that. And I think that's become increasingly clear in recent years, but it wasn't even as early, I would say, as 10 years ago. They do not believe that we are not interested in spheres of influence or that we will not intervene in areas of Chinese core interests. Again, the problem of the overlapping security interests as opposed to geographically, geopolitically separated security interests. And yet, China has, of course, benefited from the U.S. created and supported system, sometimes we say that rules-based international order that we underwrite. And so I would argue, I think, and working through some of these ideas, that Beijing wants it both ways. They want the benefits of a system that is generally pacific, it is peaceful, it allows for trade and engagement and interaction and student exchanges and intellectual exchanges, but Beijing also wants the freedom to undermine that system when and where it wants. So, and this is something that's very hard, I think, for Washington to accept, the geostrategic dynamic will always rest with China. We've assumed since 1945 and definitely since 1991-92 that the geostrategic dynamic rested with us, right? As the hyperpower, as the power that could set the rules, could underwrite the system, intervene where and when it wanted, usually with very little cost. The reality is that this dynamic, certainly in the Indo-Pacific, and some would argue even more broadly, though I won't talk about Africa or Latin America, but that it actually rests with China and its freedom to intervene where and when it wants to support or undermine the equilibrium. So what are our choices if what I've said makes any sense and is both legitimate as well as helpful? Helpful in a policy-making sense and legitimate in an intellectual sense. What are our choices? Well, again, our choices, and again, following Schrader, is either a balance requiring constant competition or an equilibrium, pretending that there's an equilibrium, that is undermined by constant Chinese advances. In other words, a balance by a different name. The US has begun to grasp the nettle in the past few years. I think it began in the last years of the Obama administration. It certainly became the focus of Trump foreign policy, and it has been maintained largely by the Biden administration, that we face an increasingly adversarial China. We've adapted, as I mentioned earlier, our Asian alliance system. We've added new initiatives like the Quad and AUKUS. For a while, we were in TPP. But it's still not a balancing system. We haven't yet accepted that we are in this endemic, and some would say endless, competition between two great powers. Everything we're doing, recognizing the adversarial nature of relations, the competitive nature of relations, is still because we believe that ultimately there is an equilibrium out there, the equilibrium of trade, of exchange, intellectual exchange, personal exchange, cooperation in multinational and international political organizations and non-governmental organizations and the like. We've begun to tighten up some of the policies that we think that if we don't get serious about, will not only undermine national power, but will put at risk this equilibrium that we believe exists. So for example, semiconductor chips and the competition in semiconductors, that new regulations just came out the last week that they seem pretty significant, but they have a backdoor carve-out in them, which is you can ask for for exemptions, and we have to see just how much those exemptions are asked and granted to see if this policy has any other teeth. A lot of this, though not all of it, has been encapsulated in the new national security strategy that was released last week, which seems to accept, they call it this is the decisive decade, seems to accept that we are in a competition, and thus in a de facto balance of power environment. But as I said, even now, the language that is used undermines that. Just this week at Hoover, my institution, Secretary of State Blinken said that the US should, quote, not lose sight of the cooperative aspect of bilateral ties, and reiterated the formula that we will cooperate where we can and outcompete where we must, even though outcompetition it's not a strategy. It's certainly not a goal. It's not an end point. It's a means, not an ends. And Blinken further went on to say that we needed to, quote, work together on issues like climate change, global health, and the like. Although, as usual, it is very hard to find indications of exactly where Beijing is interested with working with us on issues like that. And probably the best example would be COVID and the pandemic. If there was an issue of where we could have worked together on global health, I think that would have been the one. And it didn't work out very well. So we've moved partway down the line to disabusing ourselves of the notion that the world as it operated after 1992 was one of political equilibrium. That's our preferred end state. It was what we believed the Washington Consensus, the end of history all meant, and that therefore China, like everyone else, would simply figure it out, sign up to the rules, and uphold the system. And yet, the language that we use still doesn't seem to indicate that we have accepted the other side of the equation, that we are in a balance of power competition. It's not one like in the 17th and 18th centuries where it's constant warfare, but we are now today openly talking about conflict between the United States and China, something that was unthinkable, I would argue, just 15 years ago, maybe even 10, but certainly 15 years ago. So to end up, and so we can get to some questions and you can tear this apart, what are our prospects? Well, I don't have much to add to what I've already said, that we are in a de facto competition. I think we will continue increasingly to act that way. We may not articulate it as such, but I think we would get great strategic clarity for ourselves and for our policy, and our debates would make a lot more sense, again, from the Washington perspective, if we adopted the Schrader idea of a balance of power instead of the Fukuyama end of history political equilibrium idea. I think that accepting the reality that you are in is the first step towards creating a coherent strategy and a coherent policy. And I'll just end finally with another note from Schrader, from an article, an essay in the American History Review of 1994, which noted after 1815 that European leaders were driven to seek a lasting peace because they feared war, not because they feared revolution, but they feared war. And they had learned ultimately that war was revolution, that it led to revolution. That certainly should be a message that I would think the Chinese would take to heart. It is a message that they might get from what Russia is doing in Ukraine right now. But it's also a message for us that we need to seek lasting peace because we fear war. It was a comfortable conceit for about a half a century that we didn't have to fear war with China, even when we should have changed that conceit much earlier than we did. Now we've done it. So the question is, how actually do you ensure peace? Pretending that there's a system that is congenial to our way of thinking but doesn't really exist, or accepting a much more difficult, much muddier, and in history a much bloodier system, but one that better protects your interests than another that undermines it. So let me leave it at that. Thank you for letting me work through some of these thoughts and try to bring a little bit, maybe, of academic rigor, though I'm sure if Professor Schrader were here, as he was when I was a graduate student, he would have given this at best an incomplete. So, thank you.
So thanks very much, Michael. Questions?
Please.
Yes.
Thank you so much. First of all, спасибо, Misha. Очень интересно. I would, first of all, thank you for raising this very interesting thesis about equilibrium versus the balance of power. And I think your analysis and your diagnosis of the idea that China wants to benefit from the equilibrium, but also to challenge it whenever it sees fit and expedient, I think that's a very apt and convincing thesis to me. So I have two questions. One is about your use of the idea of hegemony, especially in that two-way analysis of the equilibrium, the balance. And the other is about political culture and what that says about U.S. strategy in the long term. The first question is that it seems that you are using some concept of hegemony both in equilibrium and in the balance of power. You do call China a not so benign hegemon, but you also say that core to the idea of the equilibrium is that it has to revolve around some kind of hegemon. And what's interesting to me is that these are quite familiar ideas. I mean, in terms of the, for example, the Achaean alliance of the Greeks and the Athenian Empire, of course, the idea is that there are autonomia of the states, but you have to have a hegemon that's at the center of the alliances. And of course, Rome signed treaties, and both equum and inequum with other powers, but it had to be the hegemon. And of course, the idea of hegemon in Chinese now is sensitive, but we used to have a tradition of talking about virtuous hegemons in the warring states. And the whole idea is that there would be a virtuous hegemon that upholds the order. But now we talk about hegemony in a negative sense. So I wonder how you understand the idea of competing hegemony. If after all, I mean, despite the difference between the two systems, if we have to have some kind of hegemon, and I fear that Latin America, Africa, and the broadly speaking, the global South or the developing world, what they see is not the distinction between equilibrium versus balance, but the competing claims of two hegemons. Now, what do you say to those powers and those regions and peoples who might think that it's just a matter of choosing one hegemon over the other, and that it seems that so far, China not being a benign hegemon is the less intrusive in terms of its global reach. And therefore, there is a tendency, you may critique, and I'm interested in hearing your critique of it, but there is a consensus amongst these regions and peoples that China is the less globally intrusive and the less outreaching of the two hegemons. So that's my first question. The second is about the role of political culture. Now, last night we talked about an imbalance of cultural understanding between the US and China, and you do lament a lack of understanding of Chinese political culture and institutional culture, and in general in the US. There was an imbalance of understanding. I would add to that and say that we also have a lack of understanding of our own allies, not just our adversaries. When I worked on the idea of Indo-Pacific, which is in the title of your book, I looked at it historically in terms of our Haushofer's theory of Indo-Pacific in Weimar Germany. What he emphasized was that we have to understand not just the political institutions, but also the political cultures of the Indo-Pacific region. And it seems to me that, for example, the way we have underused or underexploited the potential of a partnership with India is due somewhat to our lack of understanding of the political culture of the country. It seems that with the Quad and with the recent relationship, the show of the relationship between India and Russia, and the temporary détente, of course, between India and China, and in general, the lack of an active role that India plays in rebalancing the global order in favor of the US. And there could be many other examples. It seems that we not only lack an understanding of our adversaries, but also our allies. What do you say about that? And what do you think has to be programmatized for the US in order to enhance that kind of understanding and to inform a better strategy globally?
So I think the second question, very good questions, thank you. The second question to me is easier to answer, which is that I agree with you completely. We don't understand political cultures very well. I mean, again, there would be an academic approach of defining culture, then defining political culture. And that's a whole way of doing it. Let's just be, I'm in DC, so I'm in a community of knuckle draggers. So basically, it's like, do you understand what they want? Do you understand how they speak? And it's much more simple, right? In a lot of ways. And your point is exactly right. We don't understand very well. But I would argue, in part, we don't understand because post 1992, we assumed you don't have to understand anymore. That was the end of history. There's nothing to understand anymore.
Because of the institutional predominance of the liberal order, right? I think
everybody would norm into it. Now, before that, and I was, and I appreciate the Russian with which you greeted me, but as a born and bred American with no Russian blood in me whatsoever, why do I have a nickname Misha? Because in the Cold War, I did Russian area studies under a Title VI FLAS fellowship at a Title VI institution, because we did area studies. We deeply attempted as best as we could to understand political culture as well as politics, political goals, and so on and so forth. We dropped all that. We hollowed out. Area studies cratered after 1992. We didn't need it anymore, and it was seen as quasi-Orientalist, whatever. I could go on with less not nice, very descriptions that are often made about those who thought that because you had an area studies approach, you would, you were imposing views on the world that weren't there, right? You were fitting them into your framework, and so the whole idea was basically junked. And so now we have 30 years where people have not done the type of work that we at least thought would help us to have our best understanding of operative political culture and its changes over time, right? I mean, if you're going to be dealing with China, you absolutely have to discuss the changes from Maoist China to an interregnum to Deng to which just ended this week, a quasi-regularized transfer of power system over a couple of decades into what we are now, which is, a new imperial system under Xi. Right? All of that nuance to changes as opposed to finding something fixed and permanent, which some argued we were attempting to do. So I think we have to do that. I mean, there's a different argument to be made about India, and I'm unfortunately, as a huge India booster over the past decade and a half, I'm much more skeptical now that we're going to really be able to get closer to India in ways that we thought, and that's largely due to political culture in India, changes under Modi. But again, that's, to me, if you're talking about what are your restrictions in dealing with India, it's almost the same restrictions, the same set of problems you have in dealing with Vietnam. You have strategic interests, but you have very different political cultures, right? So how do you say, well, let's not worry about the political culture, let's worry about the strategic interest? Which is a legitimate way to go about it, but ultimately it does mean you're operating with far less understanding and therefore much greater opportunity for unmet expectations and misunderstanding and miscalculation than you would if you understood both the ally as well as the adversary better. On the hegemony question, that's interesting and difficult, more difficult. I'll answer the easier part of it, and then maybe we can have a longer discussion about the sort of question of hegemony itself. I mean, it's descriptive. It's not an ontological reality necessarily. There's a hegemon, and everything else centers around it. But it is how states at particular points are able to largely get their preferred policies at least not challenged, if not adopted by others around them at the least cost possible. Right? I think that's one way of defining what a hegemon is. I mean, absolute. I'm not an absolutist, so absolute hegemony is more theoretical than it is practical. Your question, very interestingly, about China as being seen as less intrusive, absolutely up until now. And when I say now, I mean the last 5 years or a little bit longer. There's no question. And Beijing was incredibly sophisticated in its public diplomacy, in its aid diplomacy, in the way it postured on the political stage, precisely to talk about we're anti-hegemony, right? That's that was a sort of old Maoist concept. But anyway, we're anti-hegemony. Hegemony is the United States. It's intrusive. It forecloses your own ability to choose your national destiny. We oppose that. We are we're supportive of all national destiny around the world, and we don't have the power to impose upon you. Now that's changed. Certainly, the idea of China as a non-intrusive hegemon first has attenuated, if not completely disintegrated, within Asia. I think it's very hard now to find Asian countries who think of China as a benign hegemon or a non-intrusive hegemon. Certainly the South China Sea nations don't see it that way. Northeast China, Japan, of course, Korea don't see it that way. Neighbors that are continental, such as India, don't see it that way. Stretching out farther is interesting. For the Chinese, it is a less important area. And so because it's been less important, they have been less intrusive. It's been far more trade-oriented, resource extractive-oriented, particularly in Africa, but trade with Latin America. And yet, I will speak again, as an American living in Washington, adopting much of that worldview. What we see as the Chinese attempts to create a world safe for autocracy, safe for illiberalism, meaning, of course, China hasn't invaded, pick your country, El Salvador or Nicaragua. But if it has supported illiberal actors in El Salvador and Nicaragua, then that has materially, or in a simple balancing of liberal actors versus illiberal actors, tilted the balance toward the illiberal actors. So from our point of view, it is not as reductionist necessarily that you say, well, China hasn't invaded any country since X year, the Vietnam border war, let's just use that one, 1979. But China would argue even, obviously, centuries before that. That's not the argument. The argument is, what is the international order that we are upholding, i.e. we think it's a political equilibrium of a rules-based international order? China's undermining that. So if Chinese actions are to encourage, promote, develop, protect illiberal actors, whether it's through facial recognition technology or elite capture through corrupt loans to political elites, or access for Chinese military in areas like Bangladesh and Myanmar, which gives it a greater sway of security influence over the Indo-Pacific region, then we think that it is an intrusive, illiberal actor, whether it's a hegemon or not. And I think that that is a battle that is being fought for the hearts and minds of the world, but Chinese actions have made it harder for Beijing to sell in the positive way. It's made it harder for Beijing to sell the benign image. COVID, debt trap diplomacy, and I understand it's a contested concept, but I think there's certainly evidence of its reality. Interference in international organizations, capture of international organizations. There's been some good work on the Chinese capture of NGOs sponsored by the UN and other NGOs. All of that, I think, has made it a less tenable thesis that China is benign, whether or not it's a hegemon. And that's where we would revert to that more political question of what is a hegemon, right? I mean, so Schrader talks about these two hegemons, largely, I think, because he saw them as invulnerable. No combination of powers could defeat either the UK or Russia. Largely, it's hard to see at this point a combination of powers defeating China. Very hard to see a combination of powers defeating the US at home. Very easy to see a combination of powers defeating the US abroad. Our problem is we're extended, right? If you look at, if I don't have the map, you know the map. If you look at the map post 1815, it's largely contiguous. There's a little bit of water in between Britain and the continent, but it's all contiguous. That's not it for our map. Our map is a very different map. In the Washington sports analogies that everyone loves, we're playing the away game. Right? We always play the away game, but it's true. We have 300,000 troops, military forces who've been out in the Indo-Pacific for decades. But the size of the Indo-Pacific, it's a drop, in the bucket. It's a drop in the water. It's nothing compared to how far you have to go. It still takes you 2 full weeks, basically, to steam from Japan down to the Malacca Strait, the most critical waterway. It takes you 3 weeks. It takes 3 weeks from the western, from San Diego, so from western CONUS, continental U.S. It takes over 2 weeks from Hawaii, and from Japan, I think it takes between 10 days and 2 weeks. It's a big area. It's a huge area, and so we've got basically one aircraft carrier out there full time to cover a massive amount of territory. So for us, the challenges to maintaining that forward presence mean we cannot count on the reserves that are continental, which really China holds, and not our archipelagic and littoral partners, let alone what comes from the U.S. So it's a very difficult strategic equation for us, which is why we find ourselves hoping that there's an equilibrium that no one wants to challenge, because if someone's really challenging us, it's actually quite easy, and it's much easier today than it was in 1980. So great question. I'm sorry I could keep going on. I know others have questions. Apologize.
Hannes.
Yes, thank you very much. I just have sort of a small point that adds very nicely to the former question. I thought that Biden's national security strategy was extremely interesting in one aspect that also came out in your last answer, namely that the U.S. seems to draw a new line between friends and foes as democratic regimes and authoritarian autocracies. And I wonder, how smart of a strategy is that? Because that's not the Cold War strategy, right? Because where would India, where would Turkey, where would, I don't know, potentially Hungary, we could all name different countries. Where would those countries fall if that's the line that we draw? So do you think that's just sort of a rhetorical talking point that will not have any actual influence on the real strategy of the U.S.? Or is that the line that we have to draw because it is imperative to make the world safe for liberal democracies?
That's a great question. First of all, it's DC, so it's definitely rhetorical. It doesn't mean it's also not political, but it's definitely rhetorical. That's a great question, and in part, it does go back to this hangover, I think, from the Cold War, where we convinced ourselves, though, that we were fighting the free world versus the totalitarian communist world, which was not an inaccurate description, but our definition of free was often fast and loose. Jean Kirkpatrick's Dictatorships and Double Standards is maybe the best example, but we obviously worked often with unsavory partners. Above all was Taiwan and Chiang Kai-shek. And and not until Zhang Jingguo began changing the political system from within could you even remotely. But most of our Asian partners, South Korea wasn't a democracy until the 1990s. Taiwan wasn't a democracy until the 1990s. Thailand, back and forth. Most of our partners or many of our partners were on the edge, at best. Japan was the one that, because of the occupation and the complete, the complete defeat in World War II was the one that we could shape, drawing on a brief, period of Japanese tradition of democratic representative government. So, we convinced ourselves that we were, the line, even in the Cold War, was drawn between democratic regimes and authoritarian regimes. But I think largely that was because the main field of play, to continue the sports metaphor, was Western Europe, where they were democracies, right? And it was a desire to defend the most important countries of the world who had been, the shapers of the international system. Certainly we didn't think that of Asia, despite China shaping an international system in the region for centuries. Our view was a Eurocentric Atlanticist view. So, what about today? To your point about, as I was interpreting some of it, will we miss opportunities to work with partners if we draw this bright line? Well, we may miss opportunities because we're depending on democratic partners who aren't going to step up, as much as we would miss working with authoritarian partners.
I appreciate that answer to a German.
So, that's what's being tested. We had a lot of debate last night about it. That's what's being tested today in Ukraine, right? Is how much are the democratic partners really going to step up? And I think we should be honest in recognizing that not only us, but they would likely not have stepped up if the Ukrainians hadn't stepped up.
Yeah.
If the Ukrainians hadn't decided to fight back, this thing would be over most likely, and we would have sat there and said, well, we couldn't risk World War III, so we didn't get involved, and it was foregone conclusion. So again, the question of our democratic partners. I think just for us, as you look at our history, it is largely impossible, and I don't often say that, but I think it's largely impossible for us to not articulate rhetorically the international battle being one between democracy and freedom. That goes back in democracy and autocracy. That goes back to the beginning. That goes back to literally our, beginning of the breakaway from the UK. It is just, I think, too deeply implanted in our rhetorical DNA to think of it in any other terms, even when, of course, transactionally, there are times you must work with. World War II, the best example, right? Uncle Joe, Stalin, not Uncle Joe Biden, Uncle Joe Stalin. Best example of working with not just an autocracy, but the very worst of the totalitarian regimes out there next to Hitler. We of course will do that when we face existential threats. But beyond that, I think it's impossible for us to conceive of it in any other ways because it is at the very core of our identity, of our political culture, to the previous question. But I think we're often more flexible in reality. So the question now is the degree to which we are comfortable, which we're not, still in many ways, of working with a Poland, a Hungary, countries that we see as tending towards the illiberal side of the spectrum in just this brief moment, versus the upholder countries of a post-1945 liberal democratic system. I don't think there's a final answer to your question. It's a great question, and one that Washington continually struggles with. And I do think, though, that China and Russia have now made it easier to draw that bright line, at least rhetorically. 1990s, we thought both were on that path towards liberalization. And if you go back and read the national security strategies up through even post 9/11, we were talking about great power cooperation to maintain the system, the equilibrium that these non-state rogue actors were attempting to undermine. And you didn't have to fit them into the political equilibrium because they weren't states. The challenge for us is fitting a state actor into a non-political equilibrium environment. It's very easy to say, sure, if they're non-state actors, they're not part of the equilibrium. They're just rogue groups that we have to destroy before they get weapons of mass destruction. Much harder to say, okay, China is not buying into the equilibrium. Russia is not buying into the equilibrium. We've made that transition with Russia. And if you're a European historian, which I'm not, European diplomatic historian, it is fascinating how we're back to a much more traditional view and understanding of Russia, one that we haven't had for since 1917, probably just because we didn't know how to fit a Marxist-Leninist regime initially into our world framework, but we really understood the czarists. We understood their threats to balance of power or political equilibrium pretty well, right? So we're back to a much more traditional view of Russia. It's China that's really causing us problems because we became so invested in the post-Deng or the post-Mao, the Deng era and onwards liberalization paradigm that you still see. It is still out there. And it's actually coming back, by the way. The Trump era, which I would say was an end of Obama, just like Carter got hard on the Soviets at the end. The Reagan buildup started under Carter. The Trump U-turn on, or whatever it is, J-turn, U-turn on China really started under late Obama and has continued into Biden. That is under challenge now from the traditional engagement school, which is coming back saying, no, we've got to engage. We've got to engage. It's too dangerous not to engage, especially with what's going on with Russia. So again, it's this conceit that if we just engage a little bit better, we talk a little bit slowly, the typical American, let's talk slowly and loudly and people will understand us, then that's going to get China back on side. Because ultimately, they accept the equilibrium. I think it goes back to this belief that how could they not believe the equilibrium? Yes.
Dominic.
Thank you, It's this wonderful argument, which has certainly got me convinced as an amateur in these things. Going back to the Congress of Vienna, as these questions always seem to, you'll know that the person we call the architect of that was neither British nor Russian.
Right.
It was Metternich of Austria.
Yeah.
It was a third party player in this. So I have a two-part question, really, one of which is, how does us shifting the strategic framework from equilibrium to balance of power alter the room for manoeuvre of the third-party powers? And specifically, while the US struggles to catch up and to understand India and its political culture and its place in the schema, what are the chances of India emerging as itself an entirely independent balance point? And what does that mean for the US?
Great question. I think on India, briefly, I think that is what Modi would like ultimately. I think he has felt that the way, because of the China challenge that is both continental and maritime for India, we shouldn't forget that, he's felt that the best initial approach was a partnership with Japan, then a partnership with the US, buying into the Quad structure. But the Quad is pretty moribund, I would argue, at this point. That's why I'm arguing for the JAUKUS concept. I think we need to supplant Quad with JAUKUS. And I love the idea of the Quad. I thought it was the great idea. You bring India, Japan, US, Australia's fine. Love Australia, but you're talking three really big important powers into this structure, and you'd really have the possibility of shaping the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's not going to happen. So India, I think ultimately the view is that it is its own free-floating point. And I don't know enough. I mean, obviously I deal with India. I've read about it. I've been there. I've talked with them a lot. But I still don't feel I know enough whether to say that is ultimately a sort of Nehruvian non-alignment reflex. It's sort of deep in the Indian the post-independence, post-partition Indian DNA or not. But I do think that ultimately, and this is what people say about Japan too, that ultimately they would really like to be a free-floating point and a structure around them, which is a very traditional Indo-centric view, right, of South Asia, is a center state with tributary states around it. So I'll leave it at that, but I do think that we are going to be increasingly disappointed, unfortunately, with India. But it doesn't mean you don't continue working with them from a policy perspective. You do, and I think you double down to figure out where is it that you can work with them. The rubric that Blinken used, I think we should be using for India, which is cooperate where we can and not compete where we must, but just accept what we must. That's not going to work. The other question, very interesting on the third party, of course, Metternich. The point, as I understand, again, without having either been a specialist or looked at this for a long time, the critical role that Metternich played was to ensure that the rights and interests, which included territory, honor, and the like, for the small nations was central to the Vienna settlement. But it only worked because both London and Moscow was willing. Or St. Petersburg, it's not Moscow at the time, right? St. Petersburg, probably, I forget. Yeah, St. Petersburg. I said Moscow before, but London and St. Petersburg. Both were willing to accept it. That's why you can't have a political equilibrium if, and I guess this gets to your hegemon question, if you have two, let's call them great powers for now, two great powers, two invulnerable great powers, and the others are not great powers, who are not benign. You have to have two benign powers that are willing to uphold the system. That's why Metternich was so successful. That's why you could have confidence on the part of France, Austria, and Prussia that their rights would be accepted and protected, and that they wouldn't then have to figure out, okay, which great power do I ally with? Even though you did have things like the Holy Alliance, right? But I'd have to go back and look. I was rereading how Schrader argued that, and that actually was really a question of political culture, right? It was a threat that they saw more internally to regimes than the larger system. So your point's a really interesting one. How do we work with third powers in the system if all I've been talking about is great powers? So part of the question is, who are the third powers? They have to be really influential third powers. They're not little. It's not Laos or Cambodia. Nothing against Laos or Cambodia, but it is more Japan, and some would argue India. India is so hard because population size makes it a great power. National strength size, it's not quite there yet. But Japan. So Japan likes to call itself a middle power. This is the new term that Japan's been using for about 15 years. We're a middle power, which I'm not fully comfortable with. I mean, it's 126 million people, third largest economy in the world, a $60 billion defense budget that's probably going to go up to about $100 billion. If you rank it in the world, it's not middle. It's just tier 1.5, right? But they see themselves as occupying this middle space. Another good example, it's not a unitary actor, but it is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, 10 nations that see itself precisely as the middle actor between all these great powers, India, China, Japan, US, and the like. Another middle power, potentially, though geographically more separated, Australia. See, it's just the geopolitical brilliance of the European system is that the middle powers were middly located. I mean, that it makes a big difference because you separated, as we were talking about, the security interests of the two hegemons. Here you look at the patchwork geopolitically; it's much more difficult in Asia, right? First, it's a maritime region, it's continental, archipelagic, littoral. It's all over the place. That you don't have a set field of battle, which, if you can get an equilibrium, is going to work really well. If you don't have an equilibrium, you have armies going back and forth for decades, right? So none of the Asian powers have really been able to figure out how do you play an effective third power role. The default has been to say it's not any longer geographic or as much geographic, it's institutional. Build ASEAN, build up things like TPP. That was the Japanese idea for when it went into TPP. Don't worry as much about geography, that you're going to play this balancing role within geography. It's rather institutional. And that's where I think they have the most ability to try to capture the US, capture China, because we certainly in the US, believe in these institutions, right? That's part of the post-World War II equilibrium. We set up all these institutions. They believe that that's the best way to enmesh us, just as we thought that would be the best way to enmesh China, because we're committed to these institutions. How many people outside of a few sort of hard right wing in Washington is willing to say walk away from the UN? Okay, John Bolton, my former colleague, yes. John will say walk away from the UN, but we're so bought into the UN as we're bought into working with ASEAN on the East Asia Summit, or now the Quad. We've multilateralized everything because in Asia, you can't work off of geography as much because China's the central power. Everyone else is peripheral to China. You have to work institutionally. I don't know if it fully answers your question, but it's a great question about third powers. And it really resonates if you talk with Asians. They're talking about this all the time. Yeah.
So a younger person can ask a question too.
Please.
Meanwhile, we'll go with Paul Peterson while you're.
So I'm younger than you, Harvey. I realize that.
Well, so everybody qualifies.
So yeah, it's a great talk, and
Thank you.
I'm very persuasive, and I'm not an expert in the area, so I could very well be totally off base here. But I have two questions. One is fairly straightforward Washington question. Isn't the right thing to do to militarize Taiwan so they can defend themselves, at least in the short run, like the Ukrainians, and more exactly maybe the Swiss in World War II, where they kept Hitler out of there just by making sure it was going to be very, very difficult for him to take over. So that would, if you're going to take your model and apply it, isn't that what we should be doing first and foremost? So the second question is more the big picture, and can you, and you did address this a bit, but can you really have a political equilibrium when you have two hegemons? I mean, it seems to me that's, Hobbes said something about that, right? Two sovereigns, you will go to war. And so maybe that's applicable here. And even the 19th century storyline that you have, one other way of looking at the 19th century is that the Russians really were not, they were balance of power actors. They weren't political equilibrium actors. They moved, first of all, they moved to the, across Siberia until they ran into the Japanese over there, but they were hoping to expand their power base steadily and neutralize Britain with this sort of, benign political equilibrium sounding strategy, which they weren't really following under and the other was going into the Caucasus and especially going to Constantinople. Getting to the warm port was one of the big goals of the Russians, and the big prize of World War I was going to be the Russians would get Constantinople, and there would be the collapse of the Turkish Empire, and Russia would emerge as a great power. Well, as you point out, you go to war, you might have a revolution, and the Russians discovered that, and so the story ends very unhappily. But still, if you go, they didn't know that was going to happen, and were they really as benign? And so therefore, the whole equilibrium strategy only works if you have a true hegemon that is benign.
Paul, it's a great question. So the arguments on Russia, let me start at the back end, which is the points in time that you're talking about. Schrader would have argued, I never want to put words in his mouth, but Schrader would have argued that the system had already fallen apart by then. To him, it really ends with Crimea, but there's nothing that can replace it, and it staggers on with all the different types of competition that we're familiar with until, again, 1914 and the final cataclysm of the system. So by then, he would say certainly the Russians moving into the Caucasus, moving towards the Ottomans, all of that. That was when the system was already broken down. Now, your point about moving to Siberia and meeting Japan is very interesting, because he's only talking about Europe, and he would say what was outside of the system was in 1815 it was irrelevant, because the great colonialization race hadn't really started, where you had the clashes and competitions in Africa, for example, as you saw in the 1880s and 1870s, or the great in the stands. You had the 7 Years' War, of course, with the First Great World War. But it was Europe that was pacified, not what was outside of it. But because after the 7 Years' War, and the French are basically kicked out of Canada, lost much of their presence and an effective presence in the Caribbean. Again, the empires didn't overlap. Later, when they began to overlap, that's when you had systemic breakdown and problems. But initially, it's not what Russia may or may not have done in Siberia. It's what was it doing in Europe. So to your point, clearly, and this is where I'm not a European diplomatic historian, by far the most controversial, is a little bit more academic, but why not, we're here. The most controversial and least accepted parts of Schrader's theory is precisely to your point, of Russia as a benign hegemon in Europe, but in this 1815 to 1848 or 1856 period. Now, Schrader, interestingly, was mostly anti-English. He just thought London's policies overall were very destabilizing. He was not a big fan of British, of Palmerston and other British political leaders. But where he was most criticized by European diplomatic historians was on the question of how benign was Russia. And that his argument that Russia was largely willing to surrender advantage was not as held up by the record. And of course, you have the Greek War in the 1820s, and you have a few other instances. That's where it starts getting Talmudic for me. I don't know. I can't go into the pill pull of, was it exactly, what would be your algorithm for determining that Russia was or was not benign? Political scientists would love that, right? They'd code it. What was the intervention? How serious was the intervention? What was the scale of the intervention? I'm a historian. I don't do that stuff. So I wouldn't know. Somebody could come up clearly with a rubric that would allow them to say, yeah, benign here, not benign there. So I think you've pointed out the key contentious part of Schrader. The beauty of studying with him is that he was not only probably the most well-read and in multiple languages, and German was a second language for him, or it might have been a first language in his family, but in French and in Italian, and he read everything. But he had an absoluteness of view that made things so clear when you had just surrendered to his will that you would accept, okay, this really makes sense. So that, the real criticisms of, would you ultimately come down on saying Russia is benign or not is just a different element of European diplomatic history I'm not in. But I find persuasive, always found persuasive, certainly what he would consider the core of this system, the 30 plus years up to the 1848 revolutions, in which you saw great restraint, and he goes through all the different crises of the period to show how rights were respected, territories were respected, interests were balanced, the two great powers did not intervene. And that really was the core of his system, I think. As he fully recognized, extending it out, you were watching the decline of a system, certainly after 1853.
Well,
Once you hit Crimea.
Here, too, we're seeing the decline of the system.
Oh, for sure. Well, you're saying if we had a political equilibrium.
Well, when we were
We'd see a
hegemonic,
decline of it.
Yeah. We were hegemonic after the.
So for you, Professor Schrader is a benign hegemon.
He had to be. He was my
And
one of my
so,
mentors. So yes.
there's an equilibrium between him and the other benign hegemon, Fukuyama. Anaheim, Azusa, and Fukuyama. You have to know Jack Benny to understand that. Exactly.
Yeah, so I don't know if I answered it exactly. Oh, I'm sorry. So you were asking political equilibrium, can you have it with two hegemons? Again, sort of redundantly, Schrader says yes, but they both have to be, and to Dom's question, they both have to act benignly. And his argument is that for that generation, 30 plus years, they did act benignly. You could have two hegemons. The unitary hegemon is probably the one where we think of Rome, and then maybe we misinterpret, but we think of Britain invulnerable on the high seas, sort of keeping this entire global Atlantic system going, and then U.S. post-1945.
It would seem that...
But it was a divided world after 1945. I don't think it was particularly hegemonic. Our part of it was, but the rest of it wasn't.
I'm still going after your language. So it would seem a benign hegemon is a contradiction in terms, and a unitary hegemon is redundancy.
Right, well, he has two hegemons, exactly. So
who started using this damn word hegemon? Anyway,
That's a good
I bet
question.
that comes from IR theory and not from
I'm blaming the Greeks.
history professor. No, it's a Greek. There's Greek in that word.
There's Greek in there.
But I think it was made up.
The hegemon.
How about power? or sovereign power?
Well, I like great power.
And
I mean,
how
you know,
about
great power.
peace instead of balance and equilibrium?
Well, you can have peace. I think the argument is you could easily have peace by trampling on the rights of small nations, and that's not what happened in the period. Is that their rights were respected, their claims were fairly adjudicated, their honor was upheld. You could certainly have peace without any of that holding, I would think. I do think this is this question of two hegemons or two great powers, and that's why I try, more prefer the term a great power, one who has a preponderance of an ability to influence areas around it, especially smaller nations, and it's what do you do with that? So we were benign in Europe, but we weren't particularly benign in a lot of other areas. We weren't benign in Latin America post-1945. We weren't benign in parts of the Middle East post-1945. We didn't respect rights and claims. It might have been, from our view, the best way to maintain both our security and a broader liberal system. But the 1815 settlement was not particularly moral. The post-1945 settlement was justified as moral, right, to get back to the Cold War competition. They didn't talk about morality post-1815. It was a very realpolitik view. It just eschewed much of Machtpolitik for that period, but it was a very realistic view of that you can't trust nations. You have to ensure that everyone sees the system as legitimate. Clearly, we didn't have that post 1945 for half the world.
Question over here.
We have yes, the important folks finally are speaking.
Since we've been encouraged to speak, I think it may be a sophomore question, though. I was a sophomore last year. It is, what is at stake is the rules-based international order that we're upholding. Is it that versus ambitions for empire, which, when we talk of, or at least when I hear of these older comparisons to Europe, that's maybe more of the idea that comes up, but it seems less, at least at the fore now, maybe with Russia and Ukraine or China and Taiwan. But these are very close things that have almost were unsettled even at this time, unless, new ambitions of empire. Is it that, or is it markets that you see more, or is it like the question allowance of different styles of government, democracy not being the default, or is it policies within the nations or rules within the nation that wouldn't be tolerated under one order? What do you see at stake in this fight?
That's a great question. It's a really political question, and that's, to me, the great question that hasn't been answered in Washington, which is really concerning. It would be very clear, what is your goal? You can't have a strategy without a goal. As we conflate it, everything that we say it's a strategy, and sometimes we're talking about an endpoint, sometimes we're talking about a tactic, and a strategy has to the application of the means at hand to an end, but we haven't articulated it. And I think this gets a little bit to what Paul was asking in a way, maybe. I think it is the question of an international structure in which again, to the way we interpret it or wanted to see it, that it is not open, as we call it, open. And by the way, what is the rubric that the government under Trump and Biden used for Asia? A free and open Indo-Pacific. That's as close as we get to saying what our goal is, but there's a lot of ambiguity within that. A free and open Indo-Pacific. And then supposedly we're going to have a strategy to get us to that free and open Indo-Pacific. So the challenge of Russia, the challenge of China, perhaps the challenge of Iran, some might say the challenge of Turkey, we've talked about could be the challenge of India, is instead a world divided into blocks where you have areas with a leader, a hegemon, a great power that largely determines the rules because it can impose costs on those around it. Now, We talk about it certainly from the Washington and the Wall Street perspective about global markets and the openness of markets, free trade, free flow of capital and the like based under these commonly accepted rules of accounting and exchange and the SWIFT code and all these other things. The question is, could you have that in a world of blocks? Or can you have freedom of the high seas through which we get our Nikes and our iPads and all these other things in a world of blocks, right? Because again, the concept of the equilibrium is that everything was smoothly integrated. And we set up all of these guardian-type institutions and rules to make sure that the equilibrium, which initially was political, but then expanded into economics, as you pointed out, and trade, and then expanded into things like human rights, cultural exchange, so on and so forth, all of that could be easily accepted, right? You don't have to land your plane in each country's border that you pass in the airspace. We have general international rules about flying from point A to point B if the Russians don't shoot your plane down, which they've done. They shot down Dutch planes. We never thought about it. Oh, you know what? That's exactly like a ship in the 17th century boarding your ship on the high seas. They shot down an airplane. We hadn't even thought about, well, are we in a world where we can't count on getting in an airport and getting out at another airport? Because the rules are broken down because one country sets itself up as the great power within a region. And so you have to now fly around it. That's partly technology, but it's a political culture issue. What is Russia willing to do in its quest for power? So I think it's more that. I think it's getting to a world of blocks. But that's the easy answer. The hard question after that is, so what does that mean? Can we live in a world of blocks? The 1940s geopoliticians, better the geostrategists, Nicholas Spikeman, foremost among them, would have answered no. We cannot live in a world in which our freedom of action is reduced to the quarter sphere. You know, hemisphere? Well, we were really worried about losing South America. We were worried that the Nazis are going to take over South America and we're reduced to a quarter sphere, not even the Western Hemisphere. And his argument was you can't live in that world. Our interests cannot be assured. We will always be at risk. So if we go back to a world of blocks, we're at you've asked the beginning question that people in DC haven't asked. So I'll leave it there because I know we're getting out of time. We're going to get more questions. But that is a critical question, is for us to say, okay, what does that world look like for Americans? And we've never wanted a world. Let me say one more thing, sir, before I get to your question. I want to get to it. From the beginning, and particularly in Asia, which is what I happen to know best, or at least a little bit more than other things, we have always argued for the equivalent of a free and open Indo-Pacific. We did it in the 1840s. We did it in the 1890s with the open door notes. We've had the same consistent goal. Interestingly, back then, it's because we were weak. We were weak, and we couldn't affect our national interests other than if other nations allowed us. Now it's because we're strong and we like this system. So we want an open world. We haven't asked ourselves, what does it look like if the world's not open for us? Sir, I'm sorry.
Taiwan.
Yes, sir.
And the question, I suppose, is what do you think mainland China will do with Taiwan? What should be our response? How has this been affected by Ukraine, the disaster in Afghanistan? What's your, all these theoretical concepts boil down to what are you going to do when?
Right.
And what do you think the challenge is?
And Paul asked that and I didn't answer, I'm sorry. So first, I think we should have been arming Taiwan for a long time, but it's been difficult because the Taiwanese have made bad decisions as to their national defense. They've not invested as smartly as they could have to become what we call a porcupine. Instead, they invest in tanks and things they'll be destroyed in the first 5 minutes on the beach. They want to keep the Chinese off the beaches. It's going to be very difficult, especially with rocket barrages. So we should have been arming them, but they have to make. There's only so far we can go. They have to make the right decisions, and they haven't made a lot of the right decisions. Secondly, China will never give up the idea of Taiwan reintegrating with the mainland. It's just not going to happen. And I think we understand that now. So we have a very untenable policy because we're not ultimately, I think, willing to fight over Taiwan, certainly not at the nuclear level. And let's not forget, two nuclear-armed powers have never fought a major conventional conflict with each other because they're worried you couldn't keep it conventional, that it would go nuclear. So when Biden says, sure, we're going to defend Taiwan with American troops, there's a long road before we get there, and I think we would find a lot of ways to make sure that we don't do that. We're not willing to do it with Ukraine. Again, not an ally. Taiwan's not an ally. We have a very unique relationship with Taiwan, but it is not an ally. We do not have the same commitments. If I were Xi, and maybe I know people have to run, so maybe it's the best place to wind up, may not fully answer your question. If I were Xi, I would do nothing. I'd wait. Taiwan has the lowest birth rate among developed countries in the world. It, as I said, is malinvesting in its defense. It is trying to end conscription, though it's not going to do that now because of the crisis. But if I'm Xi, I would sit there and say, you know what? One more generation, this country is going to be too small and too old to defend itself, and the Americans aren't going to be the ones to do it. I'm going to do nothing. But from what we know of his character, he wants to be known as the great reunifier. He wants to be known as the greatest leader. I'm shocked, finally, as a final point, being in Washington now 15 years after leaving Yale to go to Washington, I'm shocked to hear Blinken say what he said, that he thinks the timeline is much faster, and shocked to hear I think it was the head of Indo-Pacific Command, no, it wasn't Aquilino, I forget, I just read it yesterday, say it could be 22 or 23, maybe that was Blinken who said it, 22 this year or 23, with the former head of Indo-Pacific Command saying it could be 27, and Aquilino, and these are, you're in Washington, these are people I talk with very regularly and know Aquilino pretty well, for him to say, I think it could be sooner than that, it reveals a degree of deep concern, bordering on panic, that this is getting out of our control. Because the last thing anybody in these positions ever wants to do is put a timeline on when something really bad is going to happen, because then you got to do something about it and be ready to do something about it. And we're not, quite honestly. So we have been playing with house money for a real long time. There was no country that could have materially changed the balance of power in the traditional sense in Asia. China has. We're playing with our own money now. And we're not used to that. And I'm really concerned to this point. There's a huge mismatch between what we've said we want to do, what we'd like to do, what we're able to do, and how we're thinking about what we're going to do. And because we're a risk-averse nation who created the status quo and likes it, we will probably accept a disintegration or deterioration of part of that status quo to maintain risk averseness. Risk averseness is much more built into us until we get to that existential moment, a 9/11, a December 7th. Then we go all in. Taiwan is not that. Anyway.
If she accepts your analysis, he should walk right in.
I think he needs to, I think if I were him, I'd do nothing to force a potential response that you're not prepared for on our part. But he could walk right in, but it's a risk. He just doesn't know. So I'd wait. Why not? Anyway, thanks for taking all the time to join. I hope it made sense.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael.